Van Dyke. It was the show's creator, Carl Reiner. And once you hear why, it will change how you see the show forever. To millions of viewers, Richard Deacon was the perfect supporting character. As Mel Cooley, the balding, stone-faced television executive on the Dick Van Dyke Show, he brought dry humor and a constant sense of awkward tension, especially in scenes with the wisecracking Maury Amsterdam or the unpredictable Dick Van Dyke. But what most fans never realized is that Deacon was not playing a role that far from reality. Behind the scenes, he was serious, reserved, and often on edge, especially when Carl Reiner walked into the room. Carl Reiner, the creator and head writer of the show, was a powerhouse. He was loud, driven, always cracking jokes, and constantly rewriting scripts, even at the last minute. His style of comedy was fast-paced and loose, very different from Deacon's methodical and structured approach to acting. Deacon came from a background in theater and drama. He valued preparation, rhythm, and precision. Reiner, he thrived in chaos. That contrast set the stage for years of subtle, behind-the-scenes friction. Those close to the production later hinted that Deacon often felt overlooked, while stars like Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore were showered with praise. And Carl Reiner himself stepped in for cameos and interviews. Richard Deacon quietly faded into the background professionally and socially. He was essential to the ensemble, but rarely recognized as such. He did not say much about it publicly, but in a rare interview from the late 1970s, he admitted that working on the Dick Van Dyke Show felt like showing up for a party you were never invited to. That comment stuck with those who knew him. Was he joking? Maybe. But the tone was dry and the message clear. Something never sat right, and it was not just about screen time. It was about respect. Deacon, who had years of experience on stage and screen, reportedly clashed with Reiner over script rewrites. He hated being handed new lines minutes before filming. Reiner thought it kept things fresh. Deacon thought it was sloppy. And slowly, the resentment started to build. Richard Deacon never quite fit the mold of a sitcom star. While his co-stars thrived in the spotlight, soaking up the attention that came with network success, Deacon seemed almost allergic to it. He was not the kind of actor who hung around the set after takes, laughing with producers or cracking jokes between scenes. Instead, he operated like a man on a tightrope, arriving on time, delivering exactly what was expected of him, and vanishing before the applause even settled. The casual viewer, Deacon's performance as Mel Cooley, the bald, uptight television producer, was seamless. But what most people never knew was how much Deacon detested chaos. And the Dick Van Dyke Show, for all its brilliance, was built on spontaneity. Rewrites were common. Last-minute scene changes happened daily. Carl Reiner, who created the show and shaped much of its creative energy, thrived in a lively, unpredictable environment. But to Deacon, that approach was like nails on a chalkboard. Multiple sources, including cast interviews and biographies, mentioned how Deacon often looked uncomfortable during filming. One crew member later described a moment when Reiner handed out a completely new version of a scene just 10 minutes before they were supposed to shoot. Everyone rolled with it, except Deacon. He reportedly read the pages silently, then excused himself and left the set without explanation. No argument, no shouting, just silence. But the message rang loud. He did not want to play by Reiner's rules. This moment was not isolated. Over time, Deacon began drawing lines. He refused to do improv, even when Reiner encouraged the cast to experiment. He stuck rigidly to the script and often asked for clarifications when Reiner threw in unexpected jokes. To the rest of the cast, it was just creative play. To Deacon, it was a personal nightmare. But perhaps the most revealing clue came in his interviews. Deacon rarely spoke publicly, but when he did, he was careful, extremely careful with his words. He would praise Dick Van Dyke for his timing. He would compliment Mary Tyler Moore's poise. He even acknowledged the chemistry with Maury Amsterdam. But when it came to Carl Reiner, he dodged every time. In one interview from the early 1980s, when asked directly about Reiner's influence, Deacon said, "The writing was strong. The cast was stronger. No elaboration, no enthusiasm, just a flat, distant reply." Some fans thought he was being modest. Others heard something colder, the sound of a door closing that never reopened. Even decades later, when the Dick Van Dyke Show was celebrated in retrospectives and anniversary specials, Deacon's name was noticeably absent from panels and reunions. Reiner, always animated and talkative, never addressed the missing link. But those who had worked closely with both men said the tension had never fully lifted, and it would not be the last time that divide became obvious. By the time the Dick Van Dyke Show ended its legendary run in 1966, most of the cast had formed a tight-knit bond that lasted for years. Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore would reunite on multiple occasions. Maury Amsterdam, known for his quick wit, remained close with nearly everyone involved. Carl Reiner continued working with several of them in different projects, including nostalgic retrospectives and comedy specials. But Richard Deacon vanished, not from the industry, but from them. He did not attend wrap parties, he did not appear in reunion photos, and he certainly did not join any of the light-hearted interviews where the cast shared inside jokes or reminisced about their favorite episodes. His absence was not only noticed, it became a defining part of his legacy. For fans who had come to adore Mel Cooley's awkward charm, Deacon's disappearance from the post-show camaraderie was confusing. Why would someone so beloved on screen refuse to be part of the show's legacy? Why no interviews, no commentary tracks, no Emmy tributes, or red carpet retrospectives? One producer who worked briefly with Deacon in the late 1960s gave a telling account. According to him, Deacon would only agree to participate in any promotional content if certain names were not mentioned. When pressed, he allegedly named Carl Reiner specifically. The producer did not elaborate, but the implication was hard to miss. The relationship had not ended on warm terms. Industry insiders often said Deacon resented how Reiner handled the show's creative decisions. He felt his character had been sidelined in later seasons, even though Mel Cooley was a fan favorite. Some speculated that Deacon believed Reiner favored the more energetic, improvisational actors, those who could match his fast-paced style. Deacon, a trained stage actor who valued structure and discipline, may have felt alienated in a space that thrived on chaos. But even beyond that, there was a quiet frustration growing beneath the surface. Friends noted that Deacon hated being typecast. After years of playing fussy bureaucrats, neurotic managers, and the same basic role in different costumes, he grew resentful. And the Dick Van Dyke Show, for all its accolades, may have felt like the beginning of that trap. In a rare quote pulled from a 1971 radio interview, Deacon once said, "Television has a way of putting you in a box and then locking the lid." The host asked if he was referring to Mel Cooley, and Deacon just smiled and said, "You said it, not me." As the years passed, the divide between him and the rest of the cast only widened. Reiner, always charming and gregarious, seemed unbothered, or perhaps uninterested, in addressing the tension. But fans who looked closely could tell something had fractured. It was not just artistic differences, it was something personal. And then, just when the silence seemed permanent, one small moment reignited the speculation, and it came from a very unexpected source. In the early 90s, a small public television station in Illinois ran a retrospective series on classic sitcoms. It featured little-scene interviews, bloopers, and old behind-the-scenes stories that had been long forgotten. One episode focused on the Dick Van Dyke Show, and among the usual anecdotes and tributes, a short audio clip resurfaced that startled longtime fans. It was a recording from the mid-1970s, not a formal interview, but a conversation taped during a regional theater fundraiser in which Richard Deacon briefly addressed the show that had made him a household name. The quality was grainy, the audio scratchy, but his voice was unmistakable. When asked by a fellow guest if he ever missed his time working with Carl Reiner, Deacon let out a short laugh and said, "Miss it. I am just glad I survived it." The remark was followed by silence, then a change of subject, but that one sentence, delivered half joking, half serious, has lived in the memory of fans ever since. What did he mean by survived it? Was it just dry humor or something deeper? One theory is that Deacon felt creatively stifled by Reiner, who wrote or co-wrote most of the episodes. Reiner famously loved improvisation, collaboration, and changing things at the last minute, something that clashed with Deacon's more methodical, perfectionist approach. Some said Reiner treated Deacon as an afterthought, useful when the script needed a punchline or a fall guy, but rarely central to the story. Others have pointed to how Deacon was often the butt of the joke, the one mocked for his appearance, his fussiness, his lack of charm. While that was part of Mel Cooley's character, insiders believed the typecasting began to affect Deacon personally. His friends said he struggled with self-image and longed for roles that showcased his range and depth, something he never got under Reiner's creative leadership. There was even talk, unconfirmed but persistent, that during Season 4, Deacon had asked for more meaningful screen time, a request that was allegedly shut down without discussion. He was not fired, but the message was clear: no, your place. After that, Deacon reportedly stopped attending production meetings unless absolutely necessary. The archival clip gained quiet traction in niche online forums years later, where old television fans and media scholars speculated on its meaning. And while it never became mainstream news, it gave weight to what many had suspected all along: that Deacon's absence from the show's legacy was not due to time, distance, or forgetfulness. It was personal. And there is one final chapter to this, something that happened after Deacon's passing, which made everything feel even more unresolved. When Richard Deacon passed away in 1984 from heart complications at just 63, tributes from fans poured in. Newspaper obituaries praised his comedic timing and professionalism. Co-stars from other projects sent condolences, describing him as gracious, exacting, and quietly brilliant. But one name was notably absent. Carl Reiner never issued a public statement. There was no quote in Variety, no letter to the editor, not even a mention in Reiner's later autobiographies, despite the fact that the Dick Van Dyke Show had made both their careers iconic. For fans who had followed their work together, it was baffling. A few believed Reiner simply preferred to grieve privately. Others were not so sure. Years later, in a 1995 interview with the Television Academy Foundation, Reiner was asked if he had kept in touch with his old castmates. He spoke warmly of Dick Van Dyke. He lit up when talking about Mary Tyler Moore. But when Richard Deacon's name came up, Reiner paused. He was complicated. Reiner finally said, "A fine actor, precise. He wanted things a certain way." Then he moved on. That was it. No anecdotes, no warmth, no sign of fondness, only a professionally distant nod. For fans, it felt more like a formality than a remembrance. And that word, complicated, lingered. What did it mean? Was it code for tension on set, creative differences, or something more personal? There are those who have suggested that Deacon, a lifelong bachelor who kept his personal life intensely private, may have felt judged or dismissed by Reiner. The two men came from different worlds. One, a gregarious comedy writer who thrived on collaboration. The other, a reserved character actor who valued structure and space. When those two approaches clashed, it left more than just bruised egos. It left unresolved wounds. Even during the show's later anniversaries and retrospectives, Deacon's absence was noticeable. He was rarely mentioned by Reiner or the surviving cast members, almost as if he had quietly slipped out of the show's history. There were no photos, no clips, no behind-the-scenes memories aired on television specials. It was as if the character of Mel Cooley had outlived the man who played him. And yet, among fans, especially those who appreciated the nuance and subtlety he brought to each scene, Deacon's legacy never disappeared. If anything, it only became more poignant, because behind the smirks, the rolled eyes, and the snide remarks on camera, there was an actor who may have carried a quiet bitterness long after the applause stopped, and it makes what happened next all the more haunting. In the years following Richard Deacon's death, one quiet rumor began to surface. It was never printed in headlines or confirmed by colleagues, but it spread in private circles, among old industry hands and fan forums alike. The rumor that the friction between Deacon and Carl Reiner was not just creative, it was personal. Some suggested Deacon had privately resented Reiner for sidelining him. Despite being a core cast member, Deacon's screen time was limited compared to others. Carl Reiner, after all, wrote the show. He controlled the scripts. And over time, fans noticed that Mel Cooley's scenes grew shorter and less central. What began as a prominent supporting role slowly faded into the background. According to one studio staffer interviewed in a 1987 retrospective, who declined to go on the record, Deacon was not happy about how things were handled behind the scenes. That vague statement sparked decades of speculation. Some believed Reiner and Deacon had argued over the show's direction. Others thought Deacon had pushed for more screen time and was quietly punished for it. And a few believed the real story was something neither man ever wanted made public. It did not help that Reiner, known for his warmth and wit, had a sharp tongue when crossed. He could be fiercely loyal, but he could also hold a grudge. And Deacon, he was no pushover. Colleagues described him as someone who knew his worth and who did not play the Hollywood game if it meant compromising his principles. One former CBS producer once recalled a closed-door meeting where Deacon allegedly walked out after clashing with a producer about a comedic scene he felt was demeaning. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He just stood up, adjusted his tie, and left. That was the kind of man he was. Proud, professional, and unwilling to be anyone's punchline. So when the rumors of a deeper rift with Reiner emerged, fans did not dismiss them. They nodded, but the most curious part? Even decades later, neither Reiner nor anyone else close to the show ever addressed it directly. No denial, no clarification, just silence. And when silence lingers that long, it starts to sound like confirmation. Now, as more fans revisit the Dick Van Dyke Show, they are rewatching Mel Cooley's scenes with new eyes, wondering what was real, what was performance, and what pain may have been hidden just beneath the surface. And there is one final clue, buried in a forgotten interview that might bring everything into focus. Just a year before Richard Deacon passed away in 1984, he gave a rare extended interview to a small radio station in Palm Springs. It was not widely broadcast, and the tape sat in obscurity for decades. But in 2016, a transcription surfaced online, shared by a longtime fan who had archived forgotten broadcast material from television's golden age. In that interview, Deacon spoke warmly about his love for stage acting, his pride in his work on Leave It to Beaver, and his affection for the early days of live television. He talked about fame, about aging out of roles, and about what he called the bitter-sweet beauty of being remembered for one thing, even when he had done so much more. Then, near the end of the conversation, the host asked him, "Was there ever a co-star you just could not click with?" Deacon paused. There was a full 5 seconds of silence. You could hear the host shifting in his chair, unsure whether the question would be answered at all. Finally, Deacon said, "Let's just say, when someone writes your lines, edits your scenes, and shapes your character, you learn very quickly whether they are your ally or just your boss. And Carl, he was always the boss. It was not angry, it was not bitter, but it was revealing. A quiet admission that the power dynamic behind the camera had never quite sat right with him. And it was the closest he ever came to acknowledging what so many fans had long suspected, that behind the comedy, behind the laughs, behind the perfect sitcom polish, there had been something unresolved, something that, for all his talent and all his professionalism, Richard Deacon carried with him to the end. He never called Carl Reiner out by name again, never wrote about him in memoirs, never appeared at any Dick Van Dyke reunions. And when Reiner passed away in 2020, tributes flooded in from co-stars, collaborators, and celebrities. But Richard Deacon's name was never mentioned. Maybe it was just a creative clash. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe it was a wound that never healed. But now we know it was real, and it was never forgiven.